A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984. Greetings, this is Gil Crosby, excited to be with you again, and I have a special guest today, Margaret Seidler, who, amongst other things, an author, a speaker, an experienced OD practitioner who thinks she's retired, if I'm not mistaken. But that's not always the way things play out for us OD people. But she's also working on conversations about the history, the racial history of the area she's in and the United States. Charleston, South Carolina. She's been bringing people together to explore and learn and figure out how to close the racial divide in our country and in her region. At least that's the way I understand it. I'm here to learn also. So, how are you, Margaret?
I'm doing great today. It's just beautiful here in Charleston today. It's 75 degrees, low humidity, blue skies. So it's a great fall day here.
Nice. And it's beautiful here today, too, in Wilmington, Delaware. Did you get much of the hurricane?
We just got some tropical storm winds. We were very fortunate. It went to our
Okay.
upstate.
Right. Just north of you, got hammered.
Right. So I've had
Okay.
I've had the experiences with many hurricanes. We just missed that one.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness for that. And of course, our prayers go to all the people that are suffering from that right now, and also about to get hammered again down in Florida.
It is the
But
season.
it is. It's a particularly intense season.
It is.
Uh,
And thinking of that season and the seasons of these natural forces that we have to deal with, actually relate to part of why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I'm glad you started off with tropical storms and hurricanes and things like that.
well, just continue on. This is really just for the people to have a chance to hear you and hear about the work that you're doing.
And well, really thank you so much for giving me your time and support in this really important effort that hundreds of us are involved in. I want to give a little background about myself. I was born here in Charleston, South Carolina in 1952. So this year that makes me 72.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I was born in
And
the 50s also, and I'm a bit proud of it. The rock and roll was born in the 50s. So,
well, I was living in segregation down here in Charleston, and that's what I remember the 50s for.
yeah, I experienced that too. I lived in Nashville in the early 60s.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, then we've got for sure have that in common.
Yep.
So all my life, I believed until I was 65, I believed that I was a fifth generation Charlestonian. And just in 2018, I found out that I am an eighth generation Charlestonian. And
Wow.
yeah, so that's a long time. And so what I found out was that there were 100 years of Charlestonians here that I never knew about, that my mother didn't know about, that my grandmother, who was born in 1882 here, didn't know about. And it was three generations of people who were in the business of selling enslaved people. They were slave traders, human traffickers, and the like. And so, what I am doing now is I am trying to use the facts of the past that have not been shared, have not been really known in modern time, as a way to use truth to promote racial healing. And so that's really what I've been doing. I will just say that my background I worked for 30 years, as you mentioned, in the field of leadership and organization development, and I had specialties in helping leaders raise their emotional intelligence, that they got to see themselves more completely so their strengths didn't turn into their weaknesses. My other area, my major area of focus in the later part of my career, was in conflict resolution, and I translated that into conflict or polarization in local communities. So I
Oh, we've.
feel like that the work that I'm doing right now, that
Mm-hmm.
I was being prepared professionally, not knowing this is what I would be doing after I quote hung up my shingle, right?
Well, that is good preparation. We need it because the this area, I hesitate to even call it the United States. Certainly, long before it was called that, since the first Europeans set foot in Virginia, at least, has been polarized.
Yes.
It's a long history of polarization.
So Dr. Barry Johnson, who's from Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
changed my life about 25 years ago when he said that not every problem has an either or answer, that in fact it takes a both and response, this and that, to manage complex polarizing issues. And I will just tell you this, Gil, when I started teaching, learning and teaching polarity thinking 25 years ago, and I would say, we're going to study polarities, people's eyes would glaze over. They had no concept of what both and meant. It was just polarity was a foreign word. And all I have to do now is say, polarity thinking is the opposite of being polarized. And everybody says, well, when are you going to Congress? Right. I mean, so this is something that's happened in our culture, in our country in the last 25 years, where polarization is really at its peak in my lifetime, in my lifetime. And so what I've decided to do with my skill set has really been driven by three events or three life experiences that I've had that all are culminating in the book that I've just written and in some of the and in the daily work that we do. And the first is that
Well,
I was go
before you
ahead.
go further, what's the book called?
It's called Painful, Payne hyphen FUL business, Charleston's Journey to Truth. Painful business, Charleston's Journey to Truth. And Payne is, in fact, the family name that I did not know about here in Charleston, who were slave traders.
Okay, thank you. And I assume we can like go to Amazon for that.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
They're happy to send you a copy. And just so
Hmm.
you'll know, we've got a local publisher that jumped at the chance to take this book because no one has ever told the story that we're telling. And in a 6 month period, the publisher has sold over 2,500 books. And we've spoken to almost 1,400 people in this calendar year.
Nice. Hey, I want to just add a couple quick things. I know I'm talking a lot so far, so I'll shut up in a minute. But one is that like management, uh, doing Lewinian OD the way I've been taught by my father, we've always been like management and labor moving in the same direction.
Yes.
We've always been helping people get unstuck
Yes.
from us and them from what seemed like, well, at least homeostatic, I would call it,
Yes.
polarities.
Yes.
And so I've always had that deep in my brain in a different way. But, and then also, I just was excited when I first heard you speaking. I guess it was last week in a group call we were in, because just history needs to be known. And I mentioned at the time I've been working in Germany, and every German city or town I've been in has a monument to the acknowledging. It'll have generally Jewish people being herded onto a train.
Yes.
So they've been committed to not forgetting that part of their history, so that they can be more clear-headed in the present. And so I think that we need to move in that direction in this country to ever heal.
Well, I think that Germany, I've also been over there, and I think that that is a really important example that we could emulate in our country. And you just caused me to think of something that I haven't before, so I want to thank you for that. So let me say what you caused me to think of is that I think that history, I wrote it down, it's like, wow, history gives us a potential for high leverage sustainable change. It gives us
Makes
that
sense.
potential. It
Yeah,
gives us that
if we
potential.
know if we know it, if we know history, and
Right.
and not just the biased version of history that has often been written in the past.
Well, I would say it a little differently. My goal is to share a more complete history.
Hmm.
So I try and stay with words that are um, not potent for some. So
Sure,
I
sure,
would
sure.
say, so I would say that what we are doing is that we're trying to let people who have not heard a complete history have an opportunity to hear it and then do something with it now, to act on the new awareness, the new knowledge now, to make a difference between the white and the black races. So, um, j-
Well said.
thank you. So, just so you'll know, I grew up just about 5 minutes from where I'm sitting today. I'm right here on a beautiful little creek with moss draped trees. I mean, this is definitely the Carolina Low Country that is so beautiful and so natural. And I grew up right next to a plantation, and my father, whose family had moved here from Savannah, they were business people, so they had money, and he married my mother, who was from here, whose family had nothing, including education. They had nothing. So she married up. So I grew up in the country club of Charleston, adjacent to McLeod Plantation. And as a child, there may be like 15 houses in the neighborhood. We would sneak over to the plantation and look at the big, huge plantation house because we just thought it was spooky. And I remember one day we discovered there was a row of small wooden cabins down from the big mansion. And outside of the cabins was a little dirt road. And there were children the same age as the children from the country club out there playing in the dirt. And they had a brick cistern, and they were literally pumping water from the cistern in the middle of this little dirt patch and carrying buckets into their cabins. And that they were um, taking the water inside because their cabins had no indoor plumbing. And that was shocking to me because I had a golf course, I had tennis courts, I had a swimming pool, I had a huge mansion brick clubhouse. We had a small boat marina where we could go water skiing out on the creeks and the rivers. And these children had nothing. And I remember asking my mother, and I said, "Why are those people so poor?" And my mother said, "Oh, darling, that is just the way it is." So at 5 or 6 years old, you accept that, but it sits with you, right? It sits with you in a way that is disturbing. And I
Hmm.
want you to know, for people that say, "Oh, well, that's, you're old, Margaret, this is all in the 1950s." I want you to know that the last cabin was vacated in 1990. No indoor plumbing. And these were all descendants of the people who had been enslaved and made the McLeod family wealthy.
It's sobering,
It is sobering.
and the impact is in the present. Even 1990 is pretty recent, but anyway, keep going.
So that was something that really stuck with me. So when I got out of graduate school in 1980, I worked for the federal employment training programs. I was trying to do things to help people, predominantly the Black community in Charleston, because those were most of the poor people back when I got out of school. And I felt sorry for them. I really did. I had a deep sympathy. And I did what I thought was best. And it wasn't until 2015, on June the 17th of 2015, that a young white supremacist drove down to Charleston, came down 100 miles down the highway to come here, and he went into the most historic African Methodist Episcopal Church in the South, and he joined their Bible study. And at the end, while they all had their eyes closed praying, he killed 9 of them.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I was serving on the board of the airport, Charleston International Airport at that point, and we decided that we were doing a big expansion project, and we decided we needed to do something to honor what had happened. And we decided to put a permanent tribute to the Mother Emanuel Church, to both the victims who were massacred as well as the survivors. And so I got to know the survivors starting in 2015, just a couple of months after the murders. And the reason I share that is that was life-changing for me and for many in the Charleston community. And what it did was it took what might have been that sympathy that I talked about a minute ago, and it changed into something much different, and that is empathy. An empathy for what it might be like to have a lived experience in Charleston as Black instead of white. To actually imagine walking in the shoes of someone who is treated as less than, who is left out, who doesn't belong, who doesn't get the best education, who has substandard housing. It's enlightening. I think sobering, the word you used a minute ago, is another word. It's like, how could I think that I was doing all these things to help the Black community years ago, and I was really blind. I was really blind to what it's like to be Black, probably not only in the South, but Black in America. So when I found out that there was a whole nother dimension to living as an American, I worked with a police chief here, and we ran a process using my OD experience and also my experience in polarizing issues to bring the entire community of Charleston together over a 12-month period. And when I say the entire community, I mean short, tall, skinny, not so skinny, young, old, Black, white, all the neighborhoods, historic neighborhoods, blighted neighborhoods. And everybody came together to try and tell the police department what the police department could do to have a better relationship with its citizens, so we wouldn't have Ferguson's or Baltimore riots. And we had almost 1,000 people over a month come to facilitated group tables, and everybody's voice was equal. The ground rules set that for the discussions. I mean, everybody had a stake in building Charleston's future. So I felt really great about that in 2016 and 2017. I felt like I could retire and say Margaret Seidler did a lot, did a lot in Charleston. And then it was the next year, through a DNA test, that I found out that I had cousins of African descent. And they asked me to trace my ancestry, and that's how I found the 100 years that I didn't know about. And 3 generations of slave traders here, selling over 10,000 people, over 10,000 human beings. And I have documented Each and every single one, all documented.
Well, that's a lot. And just, uh, I wanted to say back to the tragedy that, you know, obviously it created this a space where people were willing to come together, and so uh, that's beautiful that you were able to influence the community that way on those issues, or at least help them join to try to figure things out for a
Let me
period of
just let me
time.
just interject and say that when this massacre happened, everybody wanted to do something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It was like, I have to do something to make it better. So I think that if there was an unstuck moment, a getting unstuck moment, that was the common experience that we all had, and nobody liked it, and so we said we're going to do something.
I wish it
So
didn't take moments like that. I keep trying to do something like that in my own community, and the interest hasn't been there so far from the people I've approached, at least. But so and then I was thinking, wow, that must have been in some ways really, really exciting to know that you had cousins of
it
African
was,
descent.
it
Yeah,
was.
yeah. And then it must have also been pretty shocking to get realized in your own personal history that there was slave owners.
Yeah, my excitement lasted 5 days until went back to these two sheets of paper my grandmother had left, and I
Uh-huh.
found these names of all these people that I thought had been in New York. And when my grandmother died in 93 and I got those sheets of paper, we found them in the family Bible. I have to say, this is a horrible thing to say. I'm going to say it though. In 1983, I was 31 and I was raised not to like people from up north. And so when I saw that we had cousins from New York, I did not disrespect my grandmother. I put the pieces of paper in a nice safe place, and I let those cousins in New York just sit right there, and come to find out that they were in New York, but they came to Charleston in 1758.
Wow.
I found out my sixth great grandfather actually founded Princeton University.
Wow.
My grandmother had an eighth grade education. Her husband had a third grade education. So, what happened to these people that were so wealthy? It's called the Civil War, and they weren't plantation owners per se. They had a house and they had a big business. So they went bankrupt. They had nothing at the end of the Civil War. So they went from wealthy, connected, to nothing. Shame.
Yeah, shame and poverty.
Shame and poverty. So my mother grew up with poverty. She always had a less than feeling about herself being married to my daddy.
Hmm.
And little did she know her family founded Princeton and went to Yale in the 1700s.
Wow. And
Crazy.
the class structure of the South. I mean, there's classism in the North, but it was a little more prominent in the South. At least that's my image of the plantation owners prior to the Civil War
Right.
were wealthy, and then there were a lot of people who were, racial designations just bug me. So, uh, because it's been used to divide people in this country, and it's all socially constructed. There's no actual science to it. But
None.
anyway, the people that were called white that were poor in the South were treated like dirt too, and sort of like got they were better off than the slaves, of course, and many of them were the overseers. But there's always been a class structure there. So being a poor white in the South would be more humiliating, I think, in some ways than in the North.
Well, I found that in my research, I have over 1,100 newspaper ads in my research, and the research is all in the back of my book. Um, that they would not just sell people, they would rent people.
Mm.
So if you couldn't afford to buy somebody, which was expensive because people were valuable, we could rent you somebody for a few days if you had a specific job. So that way you would be part of the capitalism called slavery, and you would be less likely to ever be against it. Right?
Yes, and also if it just even if you couldn't afford, your self-esteem would be higher
Right.
if you were included in the superior class.
Exactly. So just so you kind of understand this, just from a number standpoint, um, my fourth great grandfather, William Payne, and his sons, their biggest sale was in 1819, right on historic Broad Street in Charleston, at the heart of the historic district. And they sold 367 people from the estate of a man by the name of John Ball Sr. And the value of those 367 people today would be close to $7 million. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And then we've done more research and found that his son in 1835, which was only 16 years later, he died sort of early in life from yellow fever. And his estate had 600 people. I'm sure some of them were the 306, some of from the 367 before.
Mm-hmm.
And they sold them plus another 170 from his father-in-law. So within a 4-day period, 770 people were sold in downtown Charleston. I want you to know that in Charleston, that there was so much traffic congestion with selling people on the streets that in 1857, the city of Charleston outlawed public sales and they opened up what was called Ryan's Mart, which is a museum today, to take it off the streets because you couldn't get around because selling people was such big business. So,
Wow.
for example, in the first 3 decades of the 1800s, when William Payne was the biggest domestic slave trader, these people aren't people off ships. These are families living here for generations.
I recently read the 1619 Project,
All
and
right.
part of what was in there that I didn't know, I've read a lot of history about this stuff, but was that the compromise in the Continental Congress, it was something like 30 years. After 30 years, they would no longer be able to buy slaves from the Atlantic slave trade.
Right. We call that importation.
And that was it. Always the way I had read about it prior was that was like the moral thing. At least it was going to end at some point. And what the 1619 Project pointed out was that really, like all the Virginia slave owners that were part of the Congress were very happy with that, because once there was no longer slaves coming in from other countries and slave ships, it drove up the price of all the slaves, especially Virginia had the most slaves. So they made a ton of money once the slave trade was cut off. And so just these auctions you're talking about would have been after that time, at least certainly the 1851 or so that you said.
Yeah.
They would have made a lot more money because the U.S. was no longer allowing the importation of slaves.
That's right.
What I had always thought was a good thing actually just made these people even richer that were
Right. So,
dealing.
the last day of 1807 was the last day that a ship could legally do that.
Okay.
And one thing to know about Virginia too, in my research, is that I found that Virginia ruined its soil with tobacco, and so a lot of the enslaved were then either shipped or walked out to, say, Louisiana, Texas, and beyond. So there was a migration, a forced migration where people were sold, and it was probably when families were most vulnerable to being separated. So I think what I want your listeners to hear is that it wasn't until 1998, and so that makes me, let's see, 98, I was 46 years old, that when this man by the name of Edward Ball, who was a descendant of the Ball family that I was just speaking of,
Mm-hmm.
that he wrote a book called Slaves in the Family,
Mm.
that anybody in Charleston who is, and I'm going to say white, ever even talked about slavery. We didn't ever even discuss it. It wasn't even a thought. It was like, oh, that was a long time ago. That's just history. We didn't talk about it. And so when Edward Ball wrote that book and alienated his entire family, it ripped the Band-Aid off. And what is good about that is, we're 25, 26 years later now. And so conversations about race and race relations and trying to bridge the racial divide are almost something you hear every day. I mean, we had our new International African American Museum come online last summer. It took over 20 years to get it built. The genesis for that was Edward Ball's book. Our former Mayor Joe Raleigh, who was mayor for 40 years, said we have got to do something. And so I think that, speaking for Charleston and surrounding areas, that we have never been more ready to have these conversations and have it in a way that people feel like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I really do. I want to just say that the history textbooks are changing, the programs are changing. Our tour guides, I've done 3 sessions with the Charleston tour guides. We have like 300 different tour guides. They're all telling a full story. Our visitor center is now got African American culture and history. They've got part of their website is totally dedicated to that. I mean, tourism is big business in Charleston. I think we're the number 1 city to visit in the country for a small city, and have been. And so it's not in the closet anymore. It's out of the closet. And I really feel like if there is ever a time to have these conversations, it's now. And there are a couple of things that we've done publicly. One is we put a bronze historical marker on the building on Broad Street in the business district where my family was selling people, and he's also raising his family upstairs. And that is a building that is in use today. It's commercial use. So nobody in Charleston in modern time even knew that people were being sold in these buildings. These aren't museums. These are buildings that are insurance companies, banks, restaurants, boutiques, you name it. And this
Sure.
coming Friday on October the 11th, we're putting our second marker on Broad Street on the other building where the 770 were sold through the business of Jervy, Waring, and White, which are very big, prominent Charleston names. So one thing is that. The other thing that I think is really important that we've done is I went and looked for people who had been enslaved by my family, and unbelievable that I found somebody, an African American genealogist helped me, found a woman who is in her 50s. She calls me after I sent an email to her family's funeral home in upstate South Carolina, and she is a sitting South Carolina state senator, Senator Mia McLeod, not related to the plantation though, Mia McLeod. And so Mia and I are going around the state and hopefully out of state speaking to groups because of our relationship and what brought us together, and trying to be a role model for how others can build relationships with people who might look different. Then the last thing that is so exciting about going back to my book, Payne-ful Business, is when I was getting ready to write it, a friend of ours who's Nigerian, who's lived here 40 years, has an art gallery, and he represents some pretty high-end African-American artists. And he connected me with one of his artists, and his name is John W. Jones, who did a book about 25 years ago called Confederate Currency, the Color of Money, which took the images, the engravings off the actual Confederate bills that still exist. And he lifted up the images, and guess what all the images on the Confederate bills were about?
Slavery?
Slavery. So Mr. Jones says, if you don't think that the Civil War was about slavery, he says, here it is, it's on the money. So he is my partner and collaborator on this book. And what he has done is he has taken dozens of the ads where my family, the Payne family, was selling human beings in the early 1800s, and they are just fully described in the ads in terms of their skill set, their familiar relationships, and he takes that and he brings them to life. All historically accurate depictions, with the exception of, I think that the clothes are not the clothes that they would have had on, but he's made them beautiful in the context of history, and he brings them to life. And there are 34 of those in the book. And we have an art exhibition that's traveling around the state of South Carolina right now that has 43. So nobody ever in this country has taken slave advertisements that are black and white, sterile, objectifying, and bring them to their own humanity and filled with respect and color, showing them how they built not only this community, but built our country. And it is, when you see these paintings, you will be moved. That is my prediction.
Well, I love that. And I mean, that sounds like a unique contribution. And I have seen uh, flyers and posters of slave auctions that are also out there in some of the history books, like the
Yes,
1619 Project. So
that's right.
there's a unfortunately a wealth of material.
Yes, and I will
It's
just say that I'm familiar with those as well. This is something where it's literally taking people being sold in an
mhm.
individual ad and brings them to life. So when we have, for example, we have a private sale for a prime young Negro wench, which means she's a childbearing age. She's a complete seamstress and ladies' maid, and she can make ladies' dresses and understands a good deal of millinery. Her character will be given in writing by the owner, who would not take double the price asked if she was satisfied to live in his family.
Oh, she wanted out. Well,
She
what a
wanted out
surprise
and
that
she got
is.
out. And so
Isn't that
there is
good?
a beautiful
Uh
painting of her
huh.
actually
It's good.
using materials, straw materials to make hats.
Well, I look
We
forward to
also,
seeing that.
so I guess the last thing that I'll mention that we're so excited about is just in the next few months, we're going to be on a PBS show called the Chavis Chronicles, and that's with Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who used to be head of the NAACP, was a civil rights advocate with Dr. Martin Luther King. And we are really honored that he has asked us to tell our story on his national show. And we hope that that will give us some more standing and ability to be seen across the nation. And then I'll just end on this. There's one thing that I ask for anybody who's listening to this. And the only ask is that if you look within your circle of influence, the fact that you've decided to listen to Gil's podcast today, you're now within our circle of influence. So I just want you to consider what is one thing you can do, one little thing that you can do to begin to bridge the racial divide. You know, whether it's to go into a space where you're not the majority, whether it's to take someone to lunch who doesn't look like you, or join an organization. What is one thing that you can do? And Dr. Martin Luther King said, we may have all come over on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now.
Makes sense. And, I'm going to add don't let anyone divide us. There's a lot of different ways to divide, like over immigration. And so that's been the playbook going all the way back to the Virginia colony. Divide and conquer, Sir Francis Bacon said it. And that's what was applied to separating the Irish that were poor indentured servants from the incoming African slaves. that's really still with us today. So
Yes.
don't let anyone divide you from others and stereotype others as bad and so on. We've it's anti-democratic. It's it's hurt us from the beginning till the present.
And it's within our power to do something about it.
Absolutely. Well, look, Margaret, this has been wonderful. Now, you mentioned this, the
Chavis.
Chavis, thank you, event, and like, how would people tune into that?
They just go look into, just Google PBS, the Chavis Chronicles, and it will show you what shows are coming up. I think they're probably going to air it for Black History Month in February of 2025.
Okay, lovely. And I'm going to send you two things. One is the first two chapters from Diversity Without Dogma, my book where I applied Lewin's approach to race relations
Thank you.
to U.S. stuff. And of course, he did a lot of that work in the U.S., mostly in the U.S. But also, there's a whole history chapter, so I'll attach that too because it starts with the papal decree of what 1492 or 1491 anyway, where the Pope basically said that any European that comes to the New World gets to own whatever they find there, including the inhabitants. But then the Columbus, and then finally the Virginia colony, and the history of the U.S. in my own summary. So there's a lot of territory to cover there. But you are covering it in a new and unique way, and I think it's wonderful. And it's will never heal until there's more work like this done and conversations like this. So I appreciate you.
Well, I just want to assure people that are listening who are white, like I am, that to take this step is actually liberating. It doesn't take a whole lot of courage. It is so liberating and freeing that is well worth the journey.
Well, I agree 100%. And again, like I mentioned earlier, those racial categories really were set up to further divide us. We're all a bunch of people, and it's wiser to know about the truth of the history as much as we can know it
Yes.
than to be ignorant to it and defensive about it and in denial and so on. That's never going to get us anywhere.
No, sir.
So thank you, Margaret. I think that's everything. Unless you have anything you want to add, anything else, any other resource, you've written this book. Maybe there's others.
There's nothing real. Well, there is another two books that I would suggest if people are interested, if they want to know more about the business of slavery. It's a 2-volume set by Christine King Mitchell here in Charleston, and that just came out, and it will give you an understanding of the business and what a business it was. People were making money hand over fist. So I would commend those two books if you want to know more about slavery and the business of slavery. If you also want to know more about what people are doing here in Charleston, there's another book that I would recommend called Sleeping with the Ancestors by Joseph McGill and Herb Frazier. And this is about how they have gone around the United States of America and spent the night in the actual cabins like I described earlier. And they've had other people sleep in the cabins with them overnight and then held conversations about race and how the legacy of slavery remains with us today.
Well, that sounds like going to a Holocaust site. I mean, I would
Yes.
imagine a lot of tears are wept.
Yes. So
Well, I'm
those
gonna.
are people we're collaborating with and have been for some time. And so those would be two that I would really recommend because one thing that Dr. Chavis said when he did the taping of his show was that he believes, and the reason that he said he asked me on this show is he said that if we have a chance, if there is a hope for bridging the racial divide, it needs to start in Charleston, South Carolina. It is the core where over 40% of the transatlantic slave trade came. People came through this port, that we're the ones, just like we were after Mother Emanuel Massacre, that can serve as a role model for the rest of this country. And just know there are so many of us in Charleston that are willing to do this. This is a labor of love.
It's a beautiful note to end on, and I need to get down there.
Come on.
So I hear you. I hear you. That's on my bucket list, Charleston.
Well, come
So
on. Don't come without calling.
I'll do that. All right. Well, thank you, Margaret. And thank you, listeners. Take care. Hey, I appreciate you listening. This, again, is Gil Crosby. And I want you to take advantage of what's available to you. I have many free materials. I am happy to talk to people about their situations, especially if you're trying to create change, either social change or organization change. We have frequent workshops that are available, T group workshops. If you have never been in a T group with us, then don't miss it in your life. It's many people have said to me, of all the trainings I've ever received, I got this one 30 years ago, and it's the only one that stuck with me. You're learning from your actual interactions with the other participants and with the faculty. The faculty are walking the same talk that they're teaching of behavioral skills. It's a training workshop. That's what the T stands for. This is done in the spirit of the creation of T groups by Kurt Lewin and his associates. It's for groups. It's for teams. That's how it was originally designed. It is a opportunity to learn about theory and put it directly into practice. Again, the original design, you learn things and then you put them into practice. It was not just all ambiguity, which is how some T groups, most are led today, where the faculty hardly says anything. That's not how this is designed. So join us for that. There's always workshops. There's the Leadership Institute of Seattle, which has certificate programs, a two-year program where you will learn from T groups and learn how to do all the organization development work that my father designed, most of it, and I continue that practice alongside my brother Chris and many other associates. So don't be a stranger. There's a lot going on. It's always changing. So be in touch, and it's on the website, crosbyod.com. I look forward to working with you in your organization or as you pursue things like reducing gun violence and decreasing racism in our society. Whatever your goals are, the social science of Kurt Lewin guides how to achieve those goals in a reliable way. And so that's what I apply and practice every day and invite you to.